Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock, so it's time for me to open this afternoon's hearing session into the examination of the South Tyneside local plan. My name is David Spencer. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination of the submitted plan. Can I remind people at this stage, please ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent settings, please. I think there are some people in the room who weren't here this morning, so can I just invite the council to do the usual housekeeping matters, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're not expecting any fire alarms, so if there is an alarm, please can you make your way to the nearest fire exit, which is just at the far side of the room, and then to the far side of the hotel car park. Toilets are in the corridor just outside of this room to the left. Please note there's cables taped to the floor, so please be careful when you're moving around the room. And if you have a car in the car park, then please ensure you've entered your registration details at the device at the hotel reception. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think most people, I'm sort of looking around, have been at hearing sessions, previous hearing sessions. Obviously, you all probably undoubtedly had liaise with Annette, and I've spoken to Annette as programme officer, so you know that she's really in charge of everything. So you're speaking to the right person there. Hopefully everybody here this afternoon is for matter 10. We're looking at policies. These are the borough-wide policies in the plan dealing with the natural. We're going to first look at natural environment. We're then going to look at green infrastructure and open space matters and landscape. We're then going to look at the borough-wide policy for development proposals in the green belt, and then we're going to finish off this afternoon by looking at the policy framework for the historic environment. We're not going to sit today beyond 5 o'clock. Hopefully we can finish a bit before then. So I'd encourage people to make concise contributions, but obviously I'm here to make sure I hear from everybody on the relevant points that you'd like to bring to my attention, with a focus on what potentially needs to be modified to the plan in order for it to be found sound. These sessions are being recorded and then uploaded onto the examination website, so participants are encouraged to use the microphones when making your contributions. But can I just check at this early stage? I don't think we've got anybody from the local press here, but does anybody wish to make their own separate recording of this afternoon's session? No? In which case, can I just go around the table to allow those who are going to contribute to this afternoon's discussion to identify themselves for the recording and for people in the room, please. If I start on my left with the council's team.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Paul Shederavian, KC for the council.
I'm Deborah Lamb. I'm the operations manager for the spatial planner team at South Tyneside Council.
Hello, I'm Claire Rawcliffe. I'm the natural environment manager for South Tyneside Council.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Higgins, property services manager for the council.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Clifford, senior planning policy officer.
Good afternoon, Chris Martin from the Home Builders Federation.
Good afternoon, sir. Jack Conroy, Savills Planning, representing Laverick Hall Farm Limited and Durham Cathedral.
Good afternoon all. I'm Mark Murphy. I'm from Pegasus Group and I'm speaking on behalf of Bellway Homes.
Good afternoon. I'm Councillor Rachel Taylor for the Green Party.
Thank you, thank you, everybody. Now we're going to work to an agenda that I've previously circulated. It's going to follow up from my matters, issues and questions. I'm probably going to largely be looking to the council in the first instance in terms of the approach that they've taken, and then where necessary and justified, I'll open it up to others to come in on that relevant point. So I can start first with my MIQ 10.1. It deals with the strategic policy 21 on the natural environment. Obviously applies to the whole of the borough. And asked the point raised in some of the representations at Regulation 19, where the criterion 4 of the policy relating to the protection of woodland and hedgerows within the borough, whether it would be whether it be necessary for soundness to kind of qualify where any loss was either unjustified or could not be mitigated. Is it Mrs. Lamb?
Yes, that's right. So in our MIQ response to 10.0, we've stated that we don't consider it necessary to have that qualifier within policy SP21. We consider SP21 to be the strategic direction in terms of the natural environment and dealing with trees and hedgerows across the borough, and we feel that those should be protected within the borough in the first instance. That sort of qualified the fact that we do also have policy 36, which covers protection of trees, woodland, hedgerows, and we feel that that provides sufficient clarity in terms of how applications would be dealt with in terms of how that affects trees and hedgerows, and that gives the flexibility in terms of how to justify trees could be lost through development proposals.
Thank you for that. For those who've made representations on this policy, I don't know, it's either for the Home Builders Federation or for I'll just stick at the moment with the Home Builders Federation. Whether what I've heard from the council is obviously a plan needs to be read as a whole. There is policy 36 as well. Whether there needs to be further content within policy SP21.
Thank you, sir. No, I mean, I agree that the plan needs to be read as a whole, but I do think then that probably puts further emphasis on the fact that SP21 and policy 36 need to be consistent with each other. And if you read one and then you read the other, there isn't a consistency there. So I do think for effectiveness, to make sure the policy SP21 is effective, it does need to reference unjustified loss in there as a qualifier, just so the two policies, when you do read them together, make sense.
Thank you. Mr. Conroy, please.
Thank you, sir. Nothing too much more to add on top of the written representations that we submitted. Just a point to note that we would agree with the wording that Mr. Martin has put forward in regards to unjustified loss. Thank you.
I had nothing further for the council. I'm just reminding myself about policy 36, which the council's directed me to. So, Mr. Chalaruvian.
Can I just make this indication? SP21 is a strategic policy. It sets out the ambitions of the council. It's an umbrella policy. It has to be read against policy 35, which makes specific provision for particular circumstances as they occur. So, sorry, not 35, 36. There's nothing inconsistent in the policy approach.
Thank you. I note everyone's positions on that. So for next item under this sort of wider strategic policy SP21, I raised the question at my MIQ 10.2 whether it was be justified or consistent with national policy to require specific measures for, I think these are sort of identified as priority species, whether that's swift bricks, bat boxes or hedgehog highways, whether that needs to be kind of reflected or embedded in policy SP21. Also cross-referred or had an eye on whether policy 47 provided a hook for the consideration of this issue, but I invite the council please to respond to MIQ 10.2.
Yes, we've set out in our response that we don't consider it necessary to include those provisions within policy SP21. As we've sort of said, it is a strategic policy for the natural environment and does sort of cover sort of broader sort of protections for priority species within our policy. But we have sort of proposed some supporting text for policy 47. Linking from criterion 4.1. So that sets out how nature should be considered and embedded within design proposals, and the council considers that this policy would allow for the features that we've sort of that you've mentioned there, swift bricks and bat boxes, to be secured as part of delivery of on-site mitigation or enhancement measures which are required by policy 34.
Thank you. I note from various representations there's support for measures for priority species, but I think others invite a degree of caution in terms of how far the plan could go. Mr. Martin first and then Mr. Murphy for Bellway.
Thank you, sir. I would just on the record say I support the changes that the council have made. I think it's right that swift bricks, back boxes, highways should be encouraged in development, but they shouldn't be mandated, and the reason for that being is the need for swift bricks and back boxes, hedgehog highways, should be assessed on a site-by-site basis. You know, it could be the case that a building, for instance, doesn't have the right orientation, it's not the right height, the surrounding context in terms of noise might mean it might not be suitable for bats, or there might be other environmental factors mean it might not be suitable for swifts, etc., for swift boxes. So I think whilst you can encourage it, I think it would be problematic, and I don't think it would be an effective policy if you had to mandate it. So I support what the council have done in terms of their changes.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Unfortunately, I'm going to be reiterating Mr. Martin again. I do believe that it would be inappropriate to require the provision of these features on all buildings where they might not be appropriate. With respect to ecology, it's not a build it and they will come approach. So I just think in terms of identifying mitigation measures, anything to be incorporated as part of a development should be led by an ecologist on the scheme, rather than just arbitrarily applying to all development across the plan area. Sorry.
Thank you for those contributions. I'm going to move on to MIQ 10.3, or the separate area of recreational disturbance. And my question was, we obviously looked at this as part of the habitat regulation assessment, and we're looking at legal compliance very early on, some time ago now, in the plan examination. It's just to come back to understanding the justification for the 7.2 kilometre zone for recreational disturbance, which I think will apply to both. Was it just from the the special area of conservation, not the special protection area? In terms of that zone, whether it's justified at that 7.2 kilometres is justified at the time of plan making, whether there are any kind of alternatives, and whether there is, appreciate work is ongoing, visitor surveys, etc., are done on a fairly frequent basis, whether there's anything that's kind of indicating that may need to change or validates the robustness of the 7.2 kilometres. So I can turn to the council first. Will it be Ms Rawcliffe or Ms Lamb?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So our position on terms of the 7.2 recreational zone basically remains the same as was set out at the stage 1 hearings. The the distance has been sort of identified through various visitor survey work, which has taken place incrementally over the plan preparation process. As set out in the Statement of Common Ground with Natural England, they are also in agreement with the retention of 7.2 kilometres for the purposes of this plan, but also, you know, that distance will be kept under review going forward.
And just to add, it does apply to both designations, the SAC and the SPA.
As the thing as we discussed at stage 1 hearings, the buffer itself is just a recognition that if there is development that will lead to further recreational pressures, it's scoping it in within the kind of habitat regulations for further work. There's going to be potentially a likely significant effect or an adverse effect that cannot be ruled out. Therefore, you need to consider mitigation. It's not necessarily saying anything and everything within 7.2 kilometres would have an adverse effect. It's going to be development that will generate a recreational pressure, further visitors.
Yeah, so it's specifically linked to recreational disturbance, not other impacts. And it's on there's sort of fairly standard approach now that it's 75% of interviewees in the visitor surveys were within that 7.2 kilometre zone from the studies that were done at the time of plan making. And that's a fairly standardised approach. It captures the majority of visitors and it doesn't allow the outliers, you know, those that have come on holiday from far distances to kind of pull it too far. So it's a fairly standardised approach across the country to apply that 75th percentile line. And that's come out at 7.2 on those earlier visitor studies.
And once a development is within the 7.2 kilometres and it's assessed through the habitat regulation assessment process in terms of the appropriate, may have to go through appropriate assessment, the mitigation is likely to take the form, is it a financial contribution towards, is it things like wardening or other measures, interventions?
Yeah, so we've been encouraged by Natural England to put in place a strategic mitigation scheme. It's very difficult for individual developments to put in effective bespoke mitigation per development. So the idea is that you put in an effective strategy that involves, you know, staffing the coast and providing that presence, that warning presence, that to educate and inform people about behaviour changes, effectively making wildlife positive behaviour changes and other impacts, and that's funded collectively by all of the developments that are captured within the recreation mitigation zone. If they choose to contribute, they can offer bespoke mitigation as an alternative. They're not forced to pay into the scheme, but it is an approach that's probably creates less burden on the developer because it's a straightforward payment and it's taken care of. They don't have to evidence that they have their own robust separate mitigation to do the same job.
But that's separate. If somebody wanted to go down the route of separate mitigation, that could take the form of alternative kind of green space to provide an alternative, attractive kind of area for recreation or visiting.
I think potentially that could form part of a package. Within South Tyneside, our visitor surveys have suggested that diverting people from the coast is actually quite tricky. It's got its own intrinsic, you know, draw for people and they tend to want to go. So the, you know, other strategic mitigation around the country have included suitable alternative green space. In South Tyneside, it's considered that that would be a potential small part, but it certainly couldn't deliver all of the mitigation. So for a development to just say, well, we've got a bit of green space, nobody from our development will go to the coast, probably would be difficult to evidence that in any robust way.
Thank you. And then in terms of how this ultimately feeds through in terms of a financial contribution, that's been the basis of further viability work. Is that because the sums or the figures are changing or have changed in terms of the additional work that was done by, is it CV, viability?
Yes, that's correct. So the as part of our action points, we submitted the new mitigation strategy, which has been produced in support of this local plan, and that identifies a figure of £737 per dwelling that falls within the 7.2 kilometre zone. That is an increase from the current total, which is
£403.
£403. So obviously that is a significant uplift and change. So we have considered through the viability work to ensure that it is a cost and a burden that could be supported through the plan process.
Thank you. If we can bring in others then, so Mr. Conroy, please.
Thank you, sir. More so a point of clarification on our end in regard to the intended application of Policy 34, which requires mitigation for residential uses falling within 7.2 kilometres. If I could turn your attention to the publication policies map, you'll note that we're looking at the northeastern corner of site SP8 falls partly within the 7.2 kilometre zone, and then the remainder of site SP8 appears to fall outside of the 7.2 kilometre zone. Now, subject to a recreational pressure being identified through future delivery on site SP8, the question we would have is whether sites that were bisected by the 7.2 kilometre boundary, i.e. where part of a residential plot may fall outside of the 7.2 kilometre zone and part of the plot falls within, would the council require a contribution for only those houses which fall wholly within 7.2, or would they require plots which are partly bisected by the 7.2 kilometres to also contribute? Again, appreciate it's getting into the granular detail, but I think it's important to understand at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Invite the council if it wants to respond to that point, please.
Yeah, so any plot with a residence that falls within the zone would be asked to make a contribution. So if part of the site and dwellings plots within the site entirely outwith the 7.2, they wouldn't be asked, but those that fall within it, in any part of it, would.
I mean, is the point, Mr. Conroy, I mean, if a site or any part of a site falls within 7.2 kilometres, it's going to trigger the habitat regulations, go through its own appropriate assessment, and presumably as part of that process there would be dialogue with the council and presumably Natural England in terms of what the extent of the likely significant effect is, what needs to be mitigated. Or are you seeking some specific detail within potentially Policy 34?
I think it was more so just an understanding of how it would be applied. I think there is reference made within the 2020 wildlife strategy referring to residential plots which fall partly or wholly within, the 7.2 kilometre buffer. I just noted, and apologies, I may have missed it, whether there was any supporting text which supported that position, but again, as you say, sir, it would be a matter to be discussed with the council at a planning application stage. It was just whether the council could provide any clarity at this stage, which I think they have done so. So, thank you.
I think probably the point I was trying to talk to is paragraph 1116, so where proposals, in this case for residential development, are within the 7.2 kilometre threshold, whether that's in part or whole, then obviously they're advised to contact the local planning authority for advice, and presumably that would be the way forward. I'm not sure it's necessary for soundness for the plan itself to try and sort of countenance every scenario. So, yeah.
Policy makes a very clear and black and white requirement about residences within the area contributing. So if part of a site is within, then those houses within that part of the site will be required to contribute. But that consultation or discussion with the local planning authority would also reveal whether this should be applied strictly in a particular case where, for example, let's just hypothesize rather than take your client's side. You've got a couple of houses in a major development site falling within, but the access to that development site is 8.5 kilometres away. Would you really require the developer to pay a contribution in those circumstances? So you don't have to apply the policy strictly if circumstances don't warrant it. And that degree of flexibility is always within the system.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, sir. The council has confirmed that the 7.2 kilometres recreational zone remains unchanged from stage 1 hearings. They have quite correctly indicated the policies that this applies to within the South Tyneside draft local plan. We believe that it is essential that this is not ignored or watered down by developers, as the policy is also supported by Natural England.
Thank you. I probably should say at this stage, I mean, obviously this plan is accompanied by a separate habitat regulations assessments that will come on to tomorrow in terms of whether that will need to be just kind of added to or any further sort of addendum to it. But I've, as part of examining this plan, I'm also caught by or work within the habitat regulations assessment, so I've got to be satisfied myself that there's not going to be an adverse effect on the integrity of the kind of qualifying features of the sites as a result of this plan as a whole. So it is these are stringent rules we operate within. Thank you. I'll move on then to my MIQ 10.4, which is around wildlife corridors. Two sort of parts to this, really. The first one is around whether it's justified and potentially consistent with national policy that development which would give rise to a significant adverse impact on kind of the value and integrity of these corridors would only be permitted where it can be suitably mitigated and compensated. I'll invite the council again to speak to its answer to 10.4, please.
Yes, so we set out in the response that we do consider that the wildlife corridors as shown as the policy map are justified and consistent with the MPPF. The corridor mapping was prepared in accordance with the MPPF paragraph 179A, which requires plans that identify and map wildlife-rich habitat and ecological networks, including wildlife corridors. The key evidence document in support of the identification of these corridors is the Wildlife Corridor Report, which is NAT 16. So this report was jointly commissioned by both Sunderland and Gateshead councils and has informed the identification of wildlife networks across the three authorities. The methodology for this work is clearly set out within that document as well, and it confirms that the wildlife corridor mapping is consistent with MPPF and has used the best available data and therefore should be considered as a robust evidence base for this local plan.
Thank you. And in terms of the sort of the baseline evidence for these wildlife corridors, they are of a value that would require, if harm arises, that they do need to be mitigated or compensated. That's justified.
Yes, so the wildlife corridors are made up of different features, and it follows on from both the Lawton Review, the Lawton Report, should I say, and the Nature Networks Evidence Handbook by Natural England 2020. So those two documents heavily informed the criteria, and following the Lawton Report, wildlife networks should be made up of core sites, which are your most ecologically rich, and then areas of secondary features which provide the linking habitat between those core sites, and stepping stones, which are possibly slightly more, where you have a lot of built development, which in a very urban borough like ours we do, then you can't always join everything up, but it provides sort of little hops for certain types of species certainly to move. And then the buffer zone, only the core sites are buffered, and this again follows on from the Lawton Report. So one of the key principles in rebuilding nature is to reduce pressure on wildlife, so reduce the pressure on those core sites by improving the wider environment, including buffering wildlife sites. And this can help improve resilience, and help sites to work at a larger ecosystem scale. So the bigger concept within the local report doesn't necessarily mean more land area. It might mean that what you have is buffered and is more resilient by what you do around it. So it can help reduce negative impacts of edge effects it can promote potential benefits of ecotones. That's where habitats transition from one into another. And the zones can help reduce impacts of adverse land management within the surrounding countryside, things like pesticide spray drift within agricultural landscapes, human and pet disturbance in more suburban or urban areas. So, for example, the ranging behaviour of urban domestic cats is 300 to 400 metres. So if you have some buffering distance between development and core sites, then you're trying to ameliorate some of those wider effects. So I believe that it's fully ecologically justified.
And from sort of thinking about sort of moving forward, I mean, does that have a significant effect or impact on the borough in terms of, by the time all these kind of sites are identified and buffering, is the result that large parts of the borough are within sort of the policy for wildlife corridors?
The policy doesn't sterilise the wildlife corridors from development. We're very much, you know, it's predicated with this word, a significant impact. So there are, you know, if a proposed development would sever a section of the wildlife corridor, that would be considered as significant. Development might be able to happen on or in the edges, and it actually provides, you know, opportunities within developments to enhance, you know, the areas that aren't developed, to improve the wildlife corridor, and perhaps what you lose in space you make up for in quality. So it doesn't preclude development, but it does shape development so that we don't lose our ecological networks, which in a very urban borough like South Tyneside, we're geographically constrained. We've got the sea to one side, we've got the highly modified River Tyne to the north. We're very urban. The little bits we have left, I think, are precious both to the residents and to the wildlife, and we need to make sure that we've got that functioning corridors.
Thank you. If I can bring in others on this part of policy 34. I don't know, Mr. Murphy, if you want to go first, and then I can hear from Mr. Martin rather than the other way round. So,
thank you, sir. I think in terms of what I'm going to just about say now is reiterating what we put in the hearing statements, but in essence, we fundamentally disagree with the extent of the buffer zones that have been identified. In some cases, I mean, if you're allocating areas of land, large swathes of land surrounding these secondary features and your core sites, appreciate that it's not going to be an overt sterilisation of those parcels of land, but you've got instances where you've got allocations which form part of the council's housing delivery supply, which are being allocated as these buffer zones, and you think, well, how can you meaningfully make a contribution towards preventing the ecological degradation of these the core sites and the secondary features at the same time as accommodate development in a meaningful way. I think that's our main point, but it's just, I think, in terms of not against the principle of identifying the buffer zones themselves. It's just, I think, when you've got an arbitrary distance allocated between these core sites and the secondary features, and then the buffer zone, it doesn't take into account the site specifics and whether some of these areas can meaningfully make a contribution towards buffer zone status. So that would be our main concern. Thank you.
I hear from Mr. Martin and then Mr. Conroy.
Thank you, sir. I support what Mr. Murphy says there. The actual approach that the council's done in terms of identifying core sites, secondary features, and buffer, in principle, that's fine for us. It's how that's then been applied. So if we look at sort of secondary features, that does include typologies like golf courses, cemetery and church grounds. I would query the biodiversity worth of some of those because they tend to be quite highly managed areas. Golf courses are regularly treated with sort of pesticides, and trees are sort of pruned not necessarily to help nature but for aesthetically, part of the course. But that's by the by. It is really the buffer zones that we have an issue with, and I think it's the arbitrary nature of 250 metres for core sites, 500 metres for international sites, and then the impact of that is if you look at Annex B of the Wildlife Corridor Review, so that you then end up with vast swathes of the borough basically falling into wildlife corridors. We discussed last week how housing figures are very tight in the borough in terms of the buffer of number of homes compared to the requirement. I think the council need every help they can to be able to promote things like windfall sites. And whilst I know Miss Rawcliffe does say that it doesn't sterilise those sites, which is true, that it can have an effect in terms of layout and density and how efficiently you can use a site. It's interesting because I know that in other instances there's a more sort of hierarchical approach to buffer zones has been promoted. So I think you were the inspector at the North Tyneside local plan. I think a hierarchical system was put in place there, or something more site specific. It just seems that work had gone in looking at the core sites, some work had gone in looking at the secondary sites, and then when you read the Wildlife Corridor Review, you get to the buffers and it's just that they've just made an arbitrary figure and just put it in there. And I just think it needs more justification, buffer sites, and a greater sort of appreciation that you're weighing up here the need for wildlife corridors with the need also that the council have to meet the housing requirement over the plan period and give every opportunity that they can get to be able to meet that.
Thank you. Mr. Conroy, please.
Thank you, sir. I won't labour the points made by Mr Murphy and Mr Martin. As we set out in our hearing statements, our stance is similar to those raised by colleagues here, in that we'd question the arbitrary nature of the 250-metre buffer zones, which clearly isn't a site-specific assessment of the development sites, including those strategic allocations within the plan. I think one other point just to add on that basis, looking at the Wildlife Corridors Review, I think it's paragraph 5.3.4, there is reference to the approach taken in Sunderland in regards to buffer zones, and I might paraphrase if that's okay. So further refinement of buffer zones also resulted in areas of existing built development being excluded for Sunderland, larger sites undergoing construction, allocated sites and other sites which had already received planning permission were also removed. So I'd question whether a similar approach could be taken here, removing buffer zones from those sites put forward for strategic allocation, linking into Mr Murphy's point about housing delivery and supply. If the council were not minded to consider such modification, we would fall back to our previous point as to why a 250-metre buffer zone has been applied. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn to the council in terms of some of the potential modifications that are being put forward by others in relation to the approach to wildlife corridors?
I think our simple response is that they're needed neither to make the policy effective or sound. What's important is the assessment that's made at the time the application is made.
Okay. I will reflect on what I've heard further. Can I just... I will reflect on it. I'll also look at, presumably the sustainability appraisal has looked at alternative policy options or policy approaches. Because I think what I'm being invited here is that there are alternatives, there potentially are alternatives. I understand the council's position. You don't think that nothing's necessary to be made. No changes are necessary for soundness. I'm just trying to, when I sort of reflect further on the matter, just to understand, will this sustainability appraisal have looked at alternatives, whether what would be the harm if we didn't have a 250-metre buffer, potentially, or there was a more flexible approach?
No, the sustainability appraisal hasn't sort of considered those options as the the policy is informed by the evidence and the wildlife corridor review, which basically has set those buffer zone distances. And like I say, it's an approach that's been a document that's supported evidence for Sunderland and Gateshead as well. So those buffer zones are applicable across those authorities as well in this report.
I've been specifically referred to the approach taken by Sunderland, which presumably is on the same shared evidence base, and an indication that's they've potentially taken a slightly alternative approach to existing sites. I'm slightly in the dark on that, but I mean, is the council aware or recognise what I'm being advised?
Yes, so it's correct that Sunderland have removed their allocations from the wildlife corridors, but at the time this evidence base was prepared, was back in 2020, Sunderland were at a much more advanced point in their plan making at that time, whereas we weren't. We've just sort of forwarded the approach from the evidence-based document. But like I say, the wildlife corridors do not preclude development. It's it's an extra sort of layer of mitigation or consideration which would have to be considered for allocations or any development coming forward within those areas.
Thank you. And then in terms of the... Oh, sorry, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. Regarding the local plan, if it's adopted, it's going to have a huge impact on wildlife corridors. And I just wanted to reiterate what officers were saying. I think we should be listening to the experts, in the wildlife corridor review and the ecologist about these buffer zones. I don't think we should be minimising them. And, regard what the developers are saying, I think we need to keep what the council have in place. I think it's really important for the ecological emergency and the climate emergency.
Thank you. And then in terms of the evidence and the extent of the wildlife corridors, I think the council has appended various maps to its statement in terms of where they are. I think my MIQ 10.5 was, I think, just to understand whether the extent and the delineation, how they're shown on the policies maps, is justified, whether there's any sort of further changes that might be necessary to the policies map before we move to any main modifications. I think that was my MIQ 10.5.
So there's been a few changes proposed, and it's really just to mop up a few mapping errors from the original exercise where, for example, buffer zones are being missed from small areas of core sites. So we've just identified some of those mapping errors and seek to rectify those, and they're fully in accordance with the methodology set out in the Wildlife Corridor Network Review.
We'll come on to it tomorrow in terms of a schedule for sort of policy map modifications. Obviously the plan the council's provided as part of its statement is quite a sort of a small scale. I think we just need to be, whatever is presented, it's kind of can clearly be identified what the changes are, so whether it's a series of smaller maps that enables people to see where those changes have been made. But I understand from the council statement there will be some further changes to the exact kind of delineation of some of these parts of the corridors. Yep. Are there anything further on wildlife corridors before I move on to the next subject? No. We move on to policy 35, delivering biodiversity net gain, BNG as it's often referred to. It obviously now is a legal requirement. Things may change, but we'll work within the current rules as they are. And it's whether, given that kind of requirement through the Environment Act, what's set out in the planning practice guidance, whether a policy on biodiversity net gain is necessary in the plan. I think the council says it is, and I think just hear why that should be considered the case in response to your MIQ 10.6, please.
Thank you. So just to be clear, that policy 35 does not repeat national policy. It obviously sets out that BNG should be made in accordance with the statutory framework, and it doesn't repeat that. So should that change, that national guidance, then that would be expected to change. The Policy 35 sets out really a locational hierarchy for the delivery of biodiversity net gain when it's off-site. So the national biodiversity gain hierarchy that is mentioned in the statutory guidance sets out a requirement to enhance on-site first, then create on-site, and then go to off-site and finally for credits. That's not what our policy does. Our support is there to support our own ecological networks, and it's a bespoke locational hierarchy. So without this guidance, developers are guided only by incentives within the biodiversity net gain metric. And there's 2 points that would guide where they might deliver off-site. One is strategic significance, where the same weight is given to delivery across the whole LNRS, the Local Nature Recovery Strategy, as and when that's adopted. And as a local authority, we are in a multi-authority local nature recovery strategy with Gateshead and Sunderland, so equal weight would be applied to delivery in those authority areas if we were to merely go off what is proposed in the statutory guidance. There's also a spatial risk multiplier within the biodiversity metric, and that penalises proposals where off-site habitats are located at a distance from the impact site. But it applies, again, this applies the same weight to both local planning authority areas and the national character area. So a developer could say, well, we're proposing within the same national character area. 2 of those apply to South Tyneside. We've got the Durham Magnesian Limestone Plateau, and that stretches from South Tyneside through 3 local planning authority areas, Sunderland, Durham and Hartlepool, so we're getting 23 miles away by the time we're in Hartlepool. And the other national character area that the metric would apply the same weight to would be the Tyne and Wear Lowlands, and that extends into 6 local planning authorities, Gateshead, Sunderland, North Tyneside, Newcastle, Northumberland and Durham. So a developer could pick any of those and it would be considered the same as if they were delivering within South Tyneside. So our policy has a South Tyneside first approach. It prioritises delivery within the borough to try and ensure that we don't end up with a net loss of biodiversity where possible. We don't want the impacts to be here and BNG to be delivered somewhere else. We want to benefit from BNG, not just for ecology, but also for health and for the ecosystem services that BNG delivery sites might bring. We're supporting our own local nature recovery strategy and nature networks like the Wildlife Corridor networks by promoting this South Tyneside first. So, yeah, we want to promote delivery of our own local nature recovery strategy and within South Tyneside as a priority. And we were guided by quite a lot of the training that we received as a local authority early doors in biodiversity net gain, where we were told that where local plans would fit in would be to shape this locational hierarchy. And that's what we've sought to do with this policy.
Thank you. Then just to assist me on the implementation of the policy, where are things with the South of Tyne and Wear local nature recovery strategy? Is that coming to fruition?
It is. So we've just the public consultation on the draft local nature recovery strategy actually closed on the 18th of January, so literally a couple of days ago. Obviously there'll be a period of time to take into account the responses to that consultation, which might result in changes to the local nature recovery strategy. The aim will be to produce a full local nature recovery strategy within the next few months. We don't have an exact date for that. As you can imagine, aligning that across 3 local authorities is more complicated than when it's entirely within one local authority. But yeah, we're seeking, that should be finalised, and it'll be finalised within 2026. I would imagine prior to the local plan actually being finalised.
Thank you. Are there any further points people wish to make in relation to the implementation of policy 35? I've got a separate question on viability, which I'll come on to, but just the construction and, as has been set out to me, the locational hierarchy for delivering biodiversity net gain. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, sir. Don't necessarily have too many comments on the policy. I do think potentially for effectiveness, it needs to be clarified that this is to do with mandatory net gain rather than non-mandatory net gain. And I do think that will be increasing importance in if the government are to be believed, then there may well be an expansion into non-mandatory net gain on some brownfield sites or certain small and medium sites. So whether it just needs for clarification, this policy applies to sites that fall under the mandatory biodiversity net gain rather than non-mandatory.
And then in follow-up, I've made a note of that, Mr. Martin. In follow-up to my MIQ 10.7, excuse me, I asked the general question. We may well come back to it tomorrow when we look at what plan-wide viability, but an opportunity for the council to just confirm whether the approach to delivering biodiversity net gain has been adequately accounted for, please.
Yes. Yes, we'll set out our MIQ response that has been considered through viability testing, and I'm going to get into a bit more detail around that tomorrow, and Mr. Newman will be here if there's any more detailed questions on that.
We'll give an opportunity to those who've made representations on this point. I don't know if it's Mr. Murphy or Mr. Martin who wants to go. Mr. Martin first, and then Mr.
Thank you, sir. It is a difficult thing to do, to make an allowance for BNG and viability, because it is extremely site specific. When I went through the viability assessment here, I think the general assumption used is £30,000 per hectare. I would suspect that's a little bit on the light side, only because if you look at what the typical cost is if you go to a third party for biodiversity units, it's typically £20,000 to £35,000 we're finding. And then obviously if you have to go down the statutory credit route, even though that's the last resort, that they sort of start at £42,000 and can go up to, albeit this is fairly rare, £650,000 per credit. And then obviously on those statutory ones you need 2 credits for every biodiversity unit, and on third party offsite I understand it's 1.5. I'm looking at Miss Rawcliffe. If you look then, if you're looking at a site, you're effectively saying a hectare site you'd only account for at best 1 biodiversity unit. Now, most sites that I've seen or aware of, it tends to be multiple units you need to achieve on a site. So from looking at it from that point of view, whilst I appreciate it's difficult to come up, and I think it is going to be a challenge for a lot of local plans in terms of how you account for BNG and viability, it does seem a little bit on the light side, I would say. And what I would like to see in a viability update is a bit of sensitivity testing potentially.
I mean, obviously, biodiversity net gain has been coming for some time. It's through national legislation. Has that had any bearing on land values, recognising that this is something that development is going to have to, by law, provide for, or sort of qualifying developments?
Yeah, and obviously where it's mandatory, it needs to be accounted for, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it causes viability issues on sites, and it's not necessarily the cost as well. It's to do with the sequential sort of preference to have it on site, which again is for ecological reasons perfectly understandable, but the unintended consequence of that is you're squeezing net developable areas, so you're likely to get fewer units on a site than, I know we talked about this in stage 1, fewer units on there than you would otherwise may get, and there's a difficulty, and you can't necessarily double up open space with BNG, for instance, because they serve different purposes, and often with BNG you may not want people sort of disturbing that area. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's one that I think the industry, especially up in the north where residential values are lower, we're still grappling with in terms of being able to address it.
Mr. Murphy, was there anything you wanted to add from Bellway's statement?
Nothing significantly beyond with what Mr. Martin has just stated there. But I was going to just say, yeah, in terms of, we do think that broadly, we provide a worked example within our hearing statement about the realities that would be associated with delivering BNG offsite, associated with Bellway's allocation, prospective allocation. And I think that, taken into account with the relationship with the council's policy about where, if off-site provision is to be accommodated within the borough, that might exacerbate a premium associated with delivering BNG off-site, associated with some of the allocations, just because you can have a number of sites which are vying for a couple of spaces which can be accommodated within the borough. So in summary, I just think, yeah, this needs to be carefully considered. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything further the council wishes to come back on those points? Ms. Rawcliffe?
I was just going to come in on Mr. Martin's sort of ask almost about the number of units required, and actually the closer you are to the development site, it is more one for one. It's as you get further away, so it does promote local delivery.
Thank you. We may well return to biodiversity net gain as part of tomorrow's wider viability discussion. I'm going to move on in terms of policy 36. So this is the policy for the protection of trees, woodland and hedgerows. My question at 10.8, and I'll turn to the council in the first instance, is whether the policy was positively prepared and consistent with national planning policy, reference to the same paragraph we discussed this morning, 131 of the MPPF, in terms of whether there needs to be, where it says existing trees are retained wherever possible. I think recognising there may be circumstances where some sort of tree loss is unavoidable.
Yes, so set out in our MIQ response, we do consider that the policy has been positively prepared and is consistent with paragraph 131. The policy supports the incorporation of trees in new developments and provides criteria which must be demonstrated to justify the loss of trees through development. I think as a starting point, sort of reflecting back on SP21, we do want to see trees and woodland hedgerows retained as far as possible within development proposals. But as acknowledged, the policy does set out that there are cases where trees will be lost through development, and that's set out within criteria 2, which sets out different sort of considerations which would have to be demonstrated by developers to justify the loss of trees within South Tyneside.
Thank you. I recall, Councillor Taylor, you referred to policy 36. Part of our previous discussion, I think it was when we were looking at some of the specific sites or climate change last week.
Yeah.
I think you obviously made comments at that time on policy 36. So, is there anything further specific you want to just raise or repeat again in relation to the policy?
Yeah, just so in answer to MIQ 10.8, I don't think the policy isn't positively prepared. I want to address a fundamental soundness issue in South Tyneside Draft Local Plan. Its failure to require the retention and integration of existing mature trees on allocated sites, even where there is sufficient space to design development around them. The National Planning Policy Framework is clear that the plan system must support the transition to net zero by 2050 and take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change. Incidental features, they are existing, functioning climate infrastructure. They capture and store carbon, reduce urban heat, manage surface water, improve air quality and support biodiversity. Permitting their routine removal in favour of a blank canvas approach causes an immediate and irreversible environmental loss within the plan period. Replacement planting does not compensate for the loss for decades. A local plan that allows avoidable tree loss cannot credibly be said to support net zero or climate resilience as required by national planning policy. Crucially, this is not something that can be left to developer discretion. Developers are legally and financially incentivised to minimise constraints and costs. Without a clear policy requirement, tree retention becomes optional, negotiated late in the process, and routinely lost to viability stage. At the viability stage. That is not plan-led development. The local plan must set the rules. It must not rely on individual developers to decide whether irreplaceable environmental assets are retained or removed. This is particularly important given the commitment South Tyneside Council itself has already made. The Council has declared a climate emergency, adopting climate action objectives and committed to protecting and enhancing biodiversity and green infrastructure. These commitments cannot be delivered if the local plan permits the routine loss of mature trees on allocated sites. There is a clear disconnect between what the Council has signed up to in principle and what the draft plan requires in practice. The NPPF also requires high-quality design that responds to site context and local character. Good design works with existing features. It does not erase them for convenience. Treating mature trees as obstacles rather than assets undermines place-making landscape character and long-term sustainability. The issue must also be viewed in the wider legal context. The Government has acknowledged it is not on track to meet legally binding environmental targets under the Environment Act 2021. In that context, it is not justified for local plans to allow the loss of existing environmental assets that directly contribute to those targets. Public expectations have changed. There is now widespread recognition that mature trees increase the quality, health and livability of new developments. Planning policy must reflect this evidence-based shift. The draft local plan does not require developers to demonstrate that tree loss has been avoided, nor does it set a presumption in favour of retention. This is a clear policy gap. I therefore submit that the plan is not justified nor effective and not consistent with national policy. To be found sound, it must be modified to make the retention and integration of existing mature trees a core requirement. With their loss permitted only where no reasonable alternative exists and where overriding public benefit is clearly demonstrated. In a declared climate emergency, planning policy must protect what already works. Leaving the fate of mature trees to developer choice is incompatible with that responsibility. Earlier on today, we were talking about tree-lined streets, NPF 3131, and it was said that it's non-prescriptive for developers. Now, I would argue that I think we need it to be very prescriptive. So, you know, current mitigation on sites, tree planting, the trees are often planted within the gardens of developments, for instance, at the college site, and there's no monitoring with past developers either regarding the trees are planted in gardens, and we've found that residents often remove those trees and they're not replaced. And of course that goes at the BNG initial figures, but then they aren't replaced. So if it's trees are kept on streets, then it's within developers' remit to keep an eye on those trees more, and once the council adopt the highway, then the council would of course take that over and those trees would be safe. Regarding hedges, going on to hedges if I may, so the hedge loss, certain sites like the IAMP in Felgate, the IAMP, about 2,500 linear metres of hedges were lost there, and if the Felgate development was to go ahead, there would be over 6,000 linear metres of hedgerow lost there, and there's been lots of tree loss on the IAMP site as well. And the knock-on effect of both of those sites, there's been road layout changes, and again more hedge loss to those, so it's a cumulative effect again. You know, that's a huge issue. So the modification request I made last week would be, just to finish up, would be, and I did mention this in Regulation 18 and 19 phase, and I'm again having to mention it here, unfortunately, would be the wording change of should retain existing mature trees in hedgerow to must retain existing trees and mature trees and hedgerow if designs feasibly allow. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll look at that suggested change versus what is already in the policy. And the policy starts, Councillor Taylor, by trees, woodland and hedgerows shall be protected and suitably retained as part of as an integral part of the design of the development. You mentioned various repeat points about particular emphasis on mature trees. Perhaps if I can invite the council in terms of just obviously aware of veteran trees can attract a particular status, but in terms of mature trees, if that was the policy wording, if that was necessary for soundness, how that would be to implement what I suppose it's what is meant by a mature tree, how's that defined in terms of a potential policy change. Mr. Rawcliffe?
In terms of defining a mature tree, it actually varies per species, what would be considered a mature specimen. So it's quite a nuanced descriptor. Veteran trees aren't necessarily old or mature trees either. They have particular features that ascribe them the word veteran rather than being purely age-related. So there's quite a lot of nuance in using the word mature tree in terms, you'd probably have to make the judgment per tree on a development rather than be able to apply a blanket age classification. For example, I'm not the arboriculture officer for the council, so I probably couldn't get into more detail than that on that particular point.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, next.
Thank you, sir. I don't necessarily have comments on the wording of the policy because I think it strikes a balance there in terms of a presumption in favour of retaining trees unless there's reasons why you can't. Often you'll find with development sites it might be that the only place you can put a safe access in, for instance, is unfortunately where a tree is and you have to lose the tree, although often in most cases you will need to do replacement planting, or it might be some piece of infrastructure. But on the whole, our members try and retain trees wherever possible, and the whole now with sort of the advent of BNG, that's especially important for developers. It makes achieving a 10% gain easier if you're not losing trees and hedgerows unnecessarily on the site. In terms of mature trees, I would caution against using that for the reasons that Miss Rawcliffe made, which is it depends on the species, it depends on the condition. I think you would need to define that through an arboricultural assessment for each site rather than using it. I think there's a danger in using it in the policy that's not readily defined. Ancient trees and veteran trees are sort of readily defined, and I guess if there are trees that fall out of that category that are seen to be of value, you would presume they would be TPO'd anyway.
Thank you. Before I invite Councillor Taylor to come back in, Mr. Murphy, I've obviously read Bellway's statement and the changes you're seeking to the policy, which I think is the qualifier in the first part of the policy, sort of where possible, or something to that effect.
That's correct. Nothing further than that. Thank you.
Councillor Taylor, I'll give you the opportunity to come back.
Thank you. We definitely need mature written in there, and as was mentioned, you need an arboriculturalist to come and say if a tree is mature, but with any kind of visual tree assessment, anyone who's an arboriculturist knows when a tree is mature. That's easily identifiable, so that should definitely be written in there, mature tree. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, very briefly.
Very briefly. I would caution against mature though, because it doesn't take account the condition of the tree. So a tree might be mature, but it could be diseased, for instance, and it might need to actually be beneficial to remove it to prevent further spread of a disease. I'm thinking things like ash dieback and that sort of thing. So it's just a caution against using that phrase.
Thank you. I'm going to move just a final point, Councillor Taylor.
definitely has to keep maturing, but it could maybe be healthy, mature trees. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on in terms of the agenda. It's the final point in terms of natural environment. I'm just mindful as part of the stage 1 work, I invited the council to add further to the existing habitat regulation assessment work, and an addendum has been prepared by the consultants who undertook the initial work, and it's at AP3 in terms of the examination material before me. I think in asking for that work, I'd obviously heard and read a lot of evidence around particularly water quality, and mindful that the council's 2 internationally protected habitats are at the coast, and in terms of just completing the whole picture, and I think for myself sort of feeling assurance that the plan is not going to have a significant effect on the qualifying features of those habitats, and probably have more in mind the special protection area and the 2 qualifying bird species, perhaps less so than the Durham Coast SAC. I just perhaps give the council, if there's an opportunity, is anything further they wish to add or draw to my attention from that work. I mean, it struck me that these qualifying bird species, there appears to be a correlation that if there is less sewage in the environment, can have, or potentially there could be a correlation in terms of an adverse impact on the numbers of these bird species, which is the wintering turnstone and the purple sandpiper.
So the studies that have been drawn on to do the addendum are kind of quite wide-ranging, and if you look into them in detail, there can be a correlation between sewage in the water and the presence of birds in certain places. However, within South Tyneside, we actually have really quite high-quality habitat, particularly at Whitburn Bents, that are supporting the birds, and I don't think I think the water quality is potentially a separate issue to that. So whilst the addendum sets out that both bird species have quite wide diets, that they wouldn't expect to be particularly adversely impacted by sewage and water quality, I don't think an improvement in water quality, there isn't clear evidence that would also have a detrimental impact on the birds. I think we have high quality habitat, and we've got quite extensive areas of high quality habitat. I don't think that food source, and it's largely the foraging resource, that's likely to be impacted by water quality issues. I think, in my view, the evidence isn't there to suggest that would be particularly impacted one way or the other by changes in water quality. I don't think it explicitly says that in the addendum, because it wasn't really the point the addendum was trying to pick. The addendum was really set out to say that they didn't see a clear evidence that the water quality issues would have an adverse impact. Wasn't really asked to look at whether improvements in water quality would also have an adverse impact. It wasn't asked to look at that in particular, but when you look at the underlying studies, I think where particularly birds are foraging around an outfall, and there are changes there, but our birds are foraging around good areas of habitat rather than specifically around an outfall.
Thank you for that. Obviously, I've got that material, and depending where the examination goes, whether there's a further HRA, so habitat regulation addendum around the main modifications, we'll come on to that in due course. It's before me, it's material. I did read the Whitburn Lodge appeal decision. The decision maker there had to undertake habitat regulation assessment, and noted that the bird SPA was not part of that. It was very much focused on the SAC, the Durham Coast, from recreation and disturbance. I've got nothing further I wanted to raise in relation to natural environments, so thank you for your contributions on that. I'm going keep going for a little bit, and then we'll probably have mid-afternoon adjournment. So issue 2 is around open space, recreation, and the general policy for the green belt. Just very briefly to the council in relation to my MOQs 10.9 and 10.10. The overarching approach to green and blue infrastructure, and whether that's soundly based in terms of what the plan is seeking to do at Strategic Policy 22. Please, Mr. Clifford.
Thank you, sir. Well, firstly, the evidence for Policy SP 22 is the Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy. That's the key evidence-based document. Chapter 3 identifies the vision and strategic objectives for the green and blue infrastructure within the borough. And these strategic objectives have informed the strategic approach of the policy. In terms of consistency with national policy, the policy applies a strategic approach as set out in MPPF paragraphs 20D and 175. It's also consistent with the green infrastructure section of the planning practice guidance, paragraphs 004 to 007. In terms of delivery, point 8 of the policy states that developer contributions will be sought where there is an identified need to improve the quality, use and value of the green and blue infrastructure network. And the Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy identifies plans and strategic projects across the borough to which financial contributions should be secured. Strategic projects in the Greenbelt have been identified as potential compensatory measures for Greenbelt allocations in the Greenbelt study. And green and blue infrastructure will also be delivered through other policies in the plan. So to summarise, we think it's an effective and justified policy approach.
Thank you. And then alongside that kind of strategic policy, it's my MIQ 10.10, the council seeking through new developments, seeking as part of the planning process through policy 37, obviously the protection of existing, protection and enhancement of existing open spaces as identified on the policies map, but also through new development to secure an amount of new open space provision. My question to the council was whether the standards and the amount of open space being sought through that policy was justified. That was my MIQ 10.10.
The open space standards have been drawn from Chapter 6, the development of standards in the open space study, and developed in accordance with the MPPF. The standards are explained in detail in the open space study and including how they were developed. For example, the access standard for accessible natural green space in Table 3, minimum open space quantity and access standards in the local plan, is drawn from Table 16, summary of quantity and access standards for accessible natural green space in the open space study. So we consider they are directly evidence-based.
And then in response to, or as part of the response to MIQ 10.10, the council is proposing a modification to part of policy 37. My question is this just the same words in a different order?
Essentially, yes, sir. The proposed modification, firstly to say the standards set out in the local plan should be considered when a development proposal relates to development of 20 dwellings or more. And the proposed modification is to ensure that the relationship between criteria 3 and 4 of the policy is clear, So the council proposes redesignating criterion 4 as 3 Roman italic 2. Just to make it very clear, it's a sort of sub-point of the overarching point.
Thank you. I'll reflect on whether that's a main modification or something that the council could do, I think, to aid that policy. I was not anticipating hearing from anybody else in relation to SB 22 or policy 37. No, in which case we'll do a few more minutes before a break. We touched upon some of this, I'm mindful of, about a week ago when we were looking at specific sites, particularly in relation to Brinkburn and Shooter Eade, in terms of how those particular locations would be potentially mitigated in terms of playing pitch provision. Obviously, the council has a wider strategic policy at policy SP 23 on this matter. I obviously have before me the playing pitch strategy, an assessment report, and the council's updated, or the council's topic paper, I think, on this matter. And I think just trying to bring all of this together, whether policy SP23 would provide a sort of a sound approach in terms of securing particularly playing pitch provision and mitigation within the borough, and whether any further modifications to the policy would be sound. I think some of them we touched upon last Tuesday, but I'll give the council the opportunity to speak to its response to MIQ 1011. I think some of the changes that the council's going to seek to introduce to policy SP23.
Yes, so as set out in the response to the MIQ, we've sort of explained how sort of this policy has been formed by playing pitch strategies to go through the plan preparation process. Obviously, it's been mentioned a few times that the current playing pitch strategy that was submitted wasn't finalised at the point of Reg 19 publication draft, but it has been informed by previous versions of the playing pitch strategy and through that emerging process as well. On the back of that, there's 3 modifications that we are proposing to policy SP23. The first modification relates to criterion 4. We are proposing to replace the word create to support in terms of Temple Park at Monkton Stadium, basically because both those sites are existing and that are in sporting use, so it just makes more sense and it's more accurate description to say support in terms of improvements to facilities at there rather than creating new ones. In relation to criterion 5, we're also proposing to add Harton and Westover Colliery's Welfare Ground as a identified site for supporting new playing field provision. And also Hebburn Riverside. The Harton and Westover Colliery's Welfare Ground is to be added on the back of the South Shields College mitigation. It's a site that's sort of being wrapped up in that and also being considered through the playing pitch strategy in terms of scenario testing. So it seems relevant to include it within the policy as a site identified for new pitch provision. And also again, the Hebburn Riverside in relation to GA1 and Action Point 11, which was produced. It's clearly being identified as a site where there'll be pitch improvements, and therefore again, it makes sense to include it within this strategic policy as a pitch site to acknowledge those works.
Thank you, and that kind of repeats or covers what was separately raised at MIQ 1012. If the council can just help me in terms of just this kind of sticks in my mind. The Harton and Westover Colliery's Welfare Ground, that's an existing facility and site, so in terms of its potential role, is it around kind of reconfiguring the provision at that site, or is it a site that can, with a bit of kind of further work and investment, could do more or provide alternative pitch provision?
That site's not in the council's ownership. However, understand that it's essentially reconfiguration with a 3G pitch replacing a grass one, and also some additional playing pitches being brought into usage.
Thank you. I've looked at various sites on my sort of travels around the borough. So in terms of the modifications to policy SP23, I've seen the Hebburn Riverside site, and that's identifiable. Can I ask for some assistance from the council in just identifying where the Hartow and Western Colliery site is, whether it's something you can either point me to a particular reference in a document, and I'll find it, and I'll find the plan and go and have a look at this site, or whether it's a separate plan that could be provided through the programme officer, just to make sure I look at the right site. It's probably all familiar to you, but as somebody from outside of the borough, I just want to make sure I looked at the right thing. Thank you. And then just finally to the council, before I invite further submissions, under policy SP23, we talked a lot about the Temple Park site on Tuesday. I'm just looking at policy. It has been consistently identified in policy SP23 as part of sports pitch provision. I mean, originally it was down for creating, but Mrs. Lamb has explained the modification would be around supporting. So it's an existing facility, and it's always been identified in policy SP23. Yep.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, sir. Just some clarity on the Harton and Westow Miners Welfare Ground. My understanding was South Tyneside College site 106, Regulation 106 was signed off because the mitigation for the playing pitch loss there was going to be at the Harton and Miners Welfare as well as Epney School. So I'm a little bit confused as how it's again mentioned here for other sites for the mitigation. Just some clarity on that, please.
I think the inclusion is to acknowledge that mitigation on the back of the college scheme. So the Section 106 agreement does sort of identify improvements at Epney and Harton and Westow. Miners Welfare, Epney is also included in Criterion 5 as well as a site for improvement. So again, it's a bit of consistency there, recognising those improvements on the back of that development.
I've identified at my agenda item under this particular policy area, I think the effectiveness of delivering new provision at Temple Park, the ability at the Epney school site, and the justification for the Harton and Westow. We discussed a lot of that last week, and I'm sort of thinking I've probably heard the evidence around some of that I need for my sort of reporting and conclusions. Perhaps will afford, I mean, given ultimately where we are in terms of the topic paper, identifying, say, the small quantitative shortfall, and I understand the council's position about thinking more widely around qualitative benefits that will arise from this. Is there anything else I need to be considering, or the council would like to bring to my attention around those sites that was not raised at matter 6 when we were looking at provision, particularly at the Temple Park site?
No, sir, I don't think there's anything we can usefully add. I think we've set out our case reasonably clearly in relation to what will result through the plan in terms of playing pitch provision and its quality.
Thank you.
What? What I'm going to suggest we do is come up to 3:30. Let's take a mid-afternoon adjournment for around 15 minutes. We can have a cup of tea, maybe spray some WD-40 on a part of the system, and hopefully when we reconvene at 3:45, whatever's going on will have sorted itself out. Okay, we could be back here for 3:45, please. 4:45, so we'll resume this hearing session for its final part this afternoon. Before we took the afternoon break, I don't know if the speaker system has resolved itself, or we'll see how far we get on, fingers crossed. I was turning to and inviting, I think, Councillor Taylor in terms of any further submissions to what I heard at Matter 6. I know you were telling me there at your concerns about deliverability at Temple Park.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, sir. Regarding Temple Memorial Park open space loss, as I mentioned previously, I had issues regarding the covenant and trust restrictions that was my understanding were placed on Temple Memorial Park. I believe it was gifted to the people of South Shields as a memorial park for public recreation and enjoyment. While the council maintain the land, it is understood to hold it subject to a covenant or trust obligations. The introduction of extensive fenced pitches risks creating exclusive or semi-exclusive use, materially altering the character of the land and potentially conflicting with the terms of the original gift. Mr Spencer, I request that you request and read the covenant to understand that fully. And regarding war memorial status, the park is recognised as a war memorial in its entirety, not solely by individual monuments. Now, by increasing organised sports, fencing and associated tree removal raises concerns regarding harm to the commemorative character setting of the park. There's also public's rights of way throughout the park and the cross through all manner of different ways through the park. These are highways in law and must remain unobstructed. So that was another thing I wanted to raise with you. And the scale of the proposal combined with the fencing and loss of permeability raises the question of whether this constitutes appropriation of public open space rather than incidental recreational use. If so, additional statutory procedures and tests would apply. And lastly, at the hearing, fencing was only confirmed by the council after the issue was raised, despite fencing being integral to the proposal operation. This detail materially affects access, covenant compliance and rights of way considerations. I respectfully submit that these matters represent significant legal constraints which could be fully addressed before the proposals can be considered sound. The council has not provided evidence that these legal constraints have been resolved or even fully assessed. Where mitigation relies on land whose future use is legally uncertain, the plan cannot be said to be effective or deliverable. In practical terms, this means the loss of open space at Chitterreed is not true and Bringburn is not truly mitigated. The plan assumes capacity at Temple Memorial Park without demonstrating that such capacity exists in open space terms, either physically or functionally or mainly legally. Therefore, I respectfully submit that the local plan fails to justify the loss of open space at Bringburn Chitterreed because the proposed mitigation is uncertain and constrained in the absence of clear, deliverable replacement open space. That loss should be supported. If I could just quickly touch upon MIQ 10.10, Table 3, the minimum open space quantity and access standards on accessible natural green space says 1,000 people per hectare is needed in Biddick. There's nearly 5,300 residents. Now, Chitterreed is 4.5 hectares, I believe, so that's already below minimum standards in that. So that's just something to touch upon. I think that's going to be actually removed in its entirety, and it is the only open space for residents of that area. So a sound local plan must be positively prepared, as we know, and consistent with other adapted strategies. By enabling the removal of Chitterreed open space, a plan fails to test the internal policy coherence with a joint health and wellbeing strategy we heard this morning. Because, and I'll quote things from that strategy, it says, to work in partnership to improve the health and well-being and quality of life of children, adults and families to reduce health inequalities. Open spaces help people be healthy and living near parks can make it easier to be active. So you've got, in contradiction with each other, different policies that I want to bring that to your attention as well. Now, open space, especially in disadvantaged housing estates, is vital to maintain is part of the council's own strategies, and again, with Tutor Reid, that's the most disadvantaged area in the whole of South Tyneside, which is already a very disadvantaged town, and that's the most disadvantaged ward in our town. So modification requests would be pretty huge modifications, which would be to remove Tutor Reid in its entirety, well, the open field, Tutor Reid and the plain pitches, removal of Brinkburn site in its entirety, and the removal of Temple Memorial Park from the plain pitch strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, some of those points were raised last week. There's probably an added dimension in there. I mean, in terms of covenants, and I'd just like to invite Mr. Higgins in terms of, obviously the council is already embarking on quite a bit of work, technical work on Temple Park. It's before me in front of the examination. Are you going down a cul-de-sac that you can't deliver?
No, the feasibility study's been undertaken with the knowledge of the land and covenant issues. The covenants are basically held by the church commissioners, and there is a precedent, as evidenced by other previous activities at Temple Park, that the church commissioners are open to covenant variations, and they were entered into when the leisure centre itself was built, and at various other times. So it's not unusual for covenants to exist on land, and it's something that we're aware of and intend to address through the process.
Thank you. And I obviously have the pitch. Obviously have the sort of the pitch assessment work that the council has undertaken. I think as I referred to on last Tuesday, you start sort of going through that and you think, well, there's potentially considerable scope here for additional pitch provision, but ultimately the report concludes by saying, actually, we think we can only deliver this certain quantum, and it's a lot less than perhaps the wider capacity. So presumably there has been some initial kind of sieving exercise, as I referred to last week. I mean, Temple Park is a significant area in terms of the potential to accommodate a variety of activities and uses.
Yes, I think the feasibility study essentially provides us a framework of options. There are a couple of areas that have been discounted in that process already, and as proposals evolve for Brinkburn and the exact mitigation that is required there is known, then the proposals for Temple Park would similarly evolve.
Thank you. And just so see if my memory works, for Shooter Eid, my recollection was that it's going to be the Temple Park, or the former Temple Park Junior School, that's going to be the focus for mitigation for that site, and that's outside of Temple. It has nothing. It's not part of the wider Temple Park.
It's not. It is adjacent to it, but it's not. They're seen as two separate entities.
So no covenant issue.
No.
And that's owned by the Borough Council.
It is. Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I believe Temple Park, I mean the junior school site is a smaller site though than Tutor Reid site.
It is, yes, and that's where the discussion about partial provision there and then quality improvements at Tutor Reid would apply.
Thank you. I'm going to move on in terms of discussion. I've made a note of that. Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Is there anything further the Council wishes to add or draw to my attention on that point? No. Okay. If there is anything to reflect further and is anything I need, I'll raise that through the Programme Officer and ask for the Council's assistance on that point, and then if it's in the examination library, others will be able to look at it. I appreciate Councillor Taylor, you've asked specifically if the covenant can be provided. I'll reflect on that. I'm going to move on to landscape as the next issue on this afternoon's agenda. The plan identifies areas of high landscape value. This is something that's of significance in national policy because it will introduce the higher bar of protect and enhance, so it probably needs careful consideration. And obviously if harm occurs there, it's probably something that's going to be given greater weight in the decision-making process. Can Council just briefly outline how it's gone about identifying the various, I think there's about 3 areas of high landscape value within the borough?
Yes, that's correct. There's 3 areas of high landscape value that have been identified on the policies map. These areas have been identified through an evidence-based work that was undertaken, the South Tyneside Landscape Character Study. That document looked at basically reviewing the designations which were included in the LDF, which had been rolled forward from the South Tyneside UDP, which was adopted in 1999. So those designations were of some age at that point. The study itself looked at looking at different aspects of landscape qualities, including enjoyment, scenic attributes, cultural and naturalness, and that's set out in our MIQ response and in the character study itself. Basically, the evidence report concludes that there's the 3 areas that were considered to be, that should be identified as areas of high landscape value were the Cleedon Hills, the summit and scarp of Bolden Downhill, and the coast, which is Trow Point to the Whitburn Coastal Park. But you'll note that the designation itself, we've proposed to extend that to the boundary of Sunderland. That's based on an additional piece of work that was undertaken in-house, which is the Coastal Designation Justification Document, which is NAT 21. It was considered that at the time the area south of the Whitburn Coastal Park also merited designation due to this area also benefiting from similar recreational activities and landscape character as that identified in the initial study. That justification was undertaken in-house by a landscape architect at the time, which sets out the reasons why we feel that that area of designation should be extended further.
Thank you, Mrs. Lamb, for the just looking at figure 3 on the council's statement. Can you just direct me to where that potentially be a proposed modification to the policies map? Or is this...
No,
was this already reflected, but it was the
is.
evidence behind it that
yes,
then...
yes.
I see. Thank you. Thank you. And then finally, under this section of the agenda, it's the borough-wide policy approach to green belts. So the plan contains a policy 41, effectively what I would describe as a development management policy for the green belt area, applies to the whole borough. My question at MIQ 1015, I think raised in various representations of whether it was necessary to have such a policy, given what's in the MPPF about cautioning against repeating what's in national policy. I'll invite the council first.
Well, we're not repeating what's in national policy. We merely acknowledge its existence. And to that end, being a substantial Greenbelt authority, I think it would be remiss of us not to have a policy reference to the Greenbelt and acknowledgement of its status in the borough and the inevitable impact it will have on decision making. So to that end, I suggest it's entirely appropriate to have this policy in here as it's worded.
Appreciate others have taken a different view. I mean, if the policy stays in, there wouldn't be a main modification. It is probably one of those areas where if a plan doesn't have a greenbelt policy, it would seem odd, whether it's strict. I suppose I'm applying myself, is it strictly necessary for plan soundness to remove the policy?
Well, I suppose what it does do is make it clear that we're not attempting to apply any further criteria which might be specific to this borough in relation to the greenbelt areas.
Mr. Martin?
Thank you, sir. To be honest, it's a bit of a funny one because I've seen plans that include policies exactly like this, and I've seen other plans where inspectors have steered away from doing it. I don't think there's any harm in having it there, because all it does, as Mr. Shedder-Avian says, it just points you to what the national policy is, and it's not even fixing the national policy. So the national policy could effectively change, and this policy would stay relevant. But at the same time, I do note, obviously, paragraph 16F saying you're not supposed to duplicate it. It's a bit of a funny one. I don't think either way, it doesn't really change anything.
In which case, final point on green belts. One of the national policy requirements, obviously, where green belt is to be altered, is to seek compensatory improvements in other parts of the green belt. Policy SP7 sets out that that would be the case in relation to those proposed sites that we've discussed previously. I think following the stage 1 hearings, I think the council has undertaken sort of further work. I think as part of that, it was action point 14 in terms of the scope for compensatory improvements, what could potentially be secured through that policy. I think it would also similarly be engaged in relation to the new policy for Town End Farm, if that's taken out of SP7. So from the council's additional work, is it able to explain, is it seeking additional detail within the plan, or is the evidence intended to demonstrate that the principle of compensation can be delivered? It's something that will require sort of further dialogue at the individual planning application stage, but for the purpose of plan making and having a proportionate evidence base, there's enough before me to be assured that if these sites come forward, there is deliverable or opportunities for deliverable compensation.
Yes, I think that's a good summary of what the council is proposing. I think the policies themselves, where this is relevant, as you mentioned, SP7, the new SP7A and also SP8 do make reference to compensatory improvements being required within the Greenbelt. But Action Point 14 sets out that there is a range of mechanisms of being able to deliver that, whether that be on-site or through strategic compensatory measures, which are identified through a variety of documents which make up the local plan evidence base, specifically the South Tyneside Greenbelt study and the Appendix C that we've talked at length at stage 1, also the Green Blue Infrastructure Strategy as well, which identifies various action plans across the borough which could help deliver compensatory improvements at a strategic level. Then we've also got the South Tyneside cycling and walking plan as well, which is fed into the IDP, which again identifies certain strategic measures which developments could make financial contributions to help satisfy this requirement.
Thank you. So just to confirm from the council, as a result of that additional work, there are no further modifications proposed to the policies or the plans. It's more a demonstration of the policy as submitted would be effective. It can be satisfactorily implemented.
Yes, so we're not proposing any modifications at this point.
there any further final points people wish to make in relation to general policy frameworks for landscape, greenbelt, open space? No? Okay, thank you. We'll come on to the final part of this afternoon's discussion. Is around historic environment heritage. Is it Mrs. Routledge from the council? Hello. Obviously, the plan sets out a number of policies to deal with this or address this matter. Obviously mindful the council throughout the plan making process has engaged with Historic England and has ultimately entered into a statement of common ground with that statutory body. I was just going to very briefly go through some of the specific points that I think Historic England still had or was still kind of being resolved through the statement of common ground. The first is in relation to policy 42, World Heritage. Is it technically just a singular World Heritage site, or is World Heritage sites still there?
There's just one.
Okay. And in terms of policy 42, in terms of, I see it's the frontiers of the Roman Empire, Hadrian's Wall, World Heritage Site, and in particular is it the Arbea complex in South Shields. Various modifications to the policy, I think, have these been agreed with Historic England?
Yes, that is correct.
And from my reading of them from the council's statement, a lot of them would seem to be sort of factual updates or just ensuring that there's kind of consistency of terminology.
Yes, that's correct. Just to make sure that the terminology matches UNESCO, PPG and MPPF.
And on the whole, I'd say those sort of changes kind of be minor modifications, but it includes a changing in criterion 1 of the policy from will be encouraged to should. And my view is whether that tips us into a main modification territory to be consulted on, because I think it's kind of the application of policy. Yeah. So that will be consulted on. And the policies map, or the map legend, so it's not a setting, it will be a buffer zone, so is that?
Yes, that's consistent with UNESCO's terminology.
Thank you. So I think my sort of conclusion is that the policy itself would be subject to a main modification, but the supporting text and the map legend would be sort of minor changes that I don't see as being strictly necessary for plan soundness. We then move on to policy 43, so development affecting heritage assets. I don't, Ms. Routledge, if you just briefly explain the proposed modifications that are set out in table 6.
Thank you. There's some slight text modification which doesn't necessarily impact the soundness of the policy, but it does make it more consistent with paragraph 206 of the MPPF.
Thank you. And within that was proposed changes to policy 43. I see, so yeah, so the additional text is highlighted in red, and there will be sort of further words kind of removed from criterion 4 and 5. I think this again is up for consistency with national policy.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, well again that's main modification territory, and it seems that Historic England are happy with those proposed changes. And then finally, in terms of policy 45, so this is coming on to development affecting non-designated heritage assets. Again, Mr. Rutledge, under my MIQ 1019, I think the council, again further with Historic England, is proposing a change to part of this policy.
Yes, that is correct. It is to more accurately reflect paragraph 203 of the MPPF.
Thank you. So when we come to the kind of non-designated, obviously, or heritage asset, non-designated heritage assets, it's a straightforward kind of a balanced judgment rather than the tests for designated heritage assets.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, again, another main modification. I had no further questions on the policy approach to the historic environment, very much guided by the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England. There are a number of changes in there that the council has identified. Obviously, they'll be available for, if we go forward to main modifications consultation, for others to comment on. I wasn't expecting any other contributions on historic environment this afternoon. No. So that's probably the ground I wanted to cover for this afternoon. I've got no further questions or points. There's a few things there to reflect on. I asked earlier for a map of or to locate the Westoat and Harton welfare. I'd be grateful if a map or a signpost where I can find that either today or tomorrow morning.
We've already sent a map
okay.
to Annette.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, if there's nothing further then, thank you everybody for your contributions this afternoon. We've got another session tomorrow morning. Again, it's probably going to be similar to this morning, where we're going to go through kind of various bits and pieces. So we've got to finish off matter 9 on climate change, which we'll do first. Then coming back to plan-wide viability, implementation, minerals and waste. And then there's a final administrative session to see the way forward, and I'm hoping to achieve that, deal with all of that by about 1 o'clock tomorrow. Okay. Thank you, everybody. See some of you again tomorrow morning. Thank you.